Good morning. I'm telling you what, having sunshine in these colder temperatures makes all the difference in how it feels. Yes, I guess that's true at all times, but it's just much more noticeable, I guess, to me. And because I even walked out without my hat this morning, and so I was worried about my ears getting cold. So anyway, but the sun is helping me, and having longer hair helps a little bit too. All right, I want to talk this morning about the word will, which is really interesting because Paul talks about it in this chapter, chapter 9. We're in Hebrews chapter 9. It's like right in the heart of that chapter. It's a pretty long chapter where he's going through, the old way versus the new way, and the sacrifices of animals and what had to be done to forgive sins, and all of that stuff, versus Jesus came, offered himself as a sacrifice, and now that covers everybody and their sins and the forgiveness of sins. But right in the middle of all of this, he's talking about he uses the analogy of a will, like a last will and testament. And back in those days, they also used the word covenant. So then we're talking about promises, and I think that's common at least in the Christian world. We talk about God's promises, inheritance, like all of that. But that word will, and I was like, I never really, in the English language, anyway, we have one word can have multiple meanings, but it really struck me wow, that's the word we use to describe what they're going to do with all the stuff that they can't take with them after they're done with their physical life, like who gets what, how it gets dispersed. And you can't even go through that process of giving people inheritance or the promises or the will. That process can't be entered into until a death has been proven. Wow, that's a literal truth, and it's symbolic, metaphorical of all of this idea of sacrifice and blood atonement. And so that really got me thinking about, when my will is the primary driver, and I'm not at living out of God's love, and that hasn't changed my heart, and so I see people as sort of me versus them, and even the process of negotiation, and that's why rules have to come into play, and I have to know what rules to play by so that I can get my will met, hopefully, and not cross lines and go against somebody else's will. These are our rules of engagement when we're living completely from the self, the ego, the survival self, versus once we've really understood God's love, that we're part of the one, he's part of us, and we stop seeing each other as opponents, and a game that kind of needs to be played, and how we negotiate in relationships and all of that. When you let go of all of that, and that's really God's will, divine will, there's a different driver in the seat, right? The higher self versus the ego. And once that transition has been made, and you really understand, and you're really living from that place of a changed heart, you don't need the rules anymore. It's a different way of living. It's a different covenant, a different promise. You just died, you do that final death to yourself, your own blood, and Jesus's blood represents that, metaphorically, that what he did, that's what he did. He died completely to himself, to his ego, and lived and showed us how to live life, a life that's driven by the understanding of love, that love is in charge of everything. I am not separate. I love you. God is love, like all of that oneness. And that's a different way of life that doesn't have to engage repeatedly in, because grace also covers all of that, that I'm not constantly having to atone for my sins and do the sacrifices and all of that. Like, my own conscience does that for me. I don't have to go through sort of a court of law, if you will. There's the word will again. That willingness, when you're living according to divine will, the divine order of love, and it's love's will that's in the driver's seat of your life versus your ego, it's a different experience of life. And that is the old covenant, new covenant. So is it your will driving your life? Like your, me, mine, like, let me get what I want, constantly in negotiation in relationships? And some of us are maybe in the in-between. I feel like I'm definitely in the in-between. Like, I'm getting it sort of academically and starting to walk it out in my life and starting to make that transition, but I'm not there yet. I don't feel like I'm there yet. I could easily fall off a cliff and go right back. But once that happens, like, it's done. When I die to the ego, or I sacrifice my own ego, and I can kind of keep that in check, I'm not as subject to other people's will. Like, my feathers don't get ruffled. I can be at peace, that peace that surpasses all understanding. My will versus your will, versus God's will versus love's will versus a last will and testament. Like, it's a really interesting analogy. That really got me to finally, I think, see it now from yet another angle and go, oh, like, that really helped. A good analogy helps my level of understanding. And I think that's true for everybody, because we don't really, we speak in words, but we don't think in words. We think in concepts and pictures. And so conceptually, I'm like, oh, I think I had another little level of understanding and insight, I think, this morning. So, and sort of even the story of Jesus and the Bible in general, and all the imagery and symbology. All right, rise and shine. On to Hebrews chapter 10 tomorrow.